Hi, my name is Roxana Shapour. I'm the publicist for BBC Persian Television, and I'm really pleased that Neil MacFarquhar could join us tonight. He's here in London for the UK launch of his new book. It's called The Media Relations Department of Hezbollah Wishes You a Happy Birthday, Unexpected Encounters in the Changing Middle East. Neil has a wonderful and unusual history. He's a fluent Arabic speaker. He grew up in Libya. He moved there with his family when he was 3 years old. And he spent about 25 years living in the region and covering the region, first for AP and then for the New York Times. He's the UN bureau chief for the New York Times, but before moving back to the States, Neil was the Cairo bureau chief for the New York Times from 2001 to 2005. And this book, I really like this book. And I don't want to say, I don't think it's right to say that it's a great primer for the region. I mean, it is certainly that, but I think it's so much more than that. I'm an Iranian, and speaking as a person who's from the region, I think that it's one of the most, one of the very few books that really goes beyond the usual stereotypes and really deals with subjects related to the region with a great deal of insight and affection. Neil obviously has great knowledge of the region, and in the narrative of the book, you realize that he has great affinity for the people that he's writing about and their stories. And I was trying to remember on the way here today, but I'd read in a review that the book aims and succeeds in writing the news with humor and compassion, something like that. And I think that's a really great way of talking about this book. And very much like the title suggests, unexpected encounters in the changing Middle East. I think the book provides a window to the debates that go on in the region and tells the stories of really extraordinary people who are trying to be agents of change in their own countries and their own communities. So, welcome.
Thank you.
I know you grew up in one of those oil compounds behind the chain link fence in the Middle East, and I've heard you talk about that, and I've also heard you say that you went back to the Middle East to see what was on the other side of the fence. So,
good evening. Thank you all for coming. You know, when you work for the New York Times, people expect you to be an expert on everything, and then as soon as they find out that you work in the Middle East, the first question they usually ask you is something simple like, when's there going to be peace in the Middle East? So I was at when I was bureau chief in Cairo, I was home on vacation. I was at a dinner party in San Francisco, and a woman came up to me and she said, I have a question for you. And I embraced, I thought, here it comes. And she said, aren't there any normal people in the Middle East? And she said, I mean, people like you and me, or at least people you can relate to. And I said, yeah, all kinds. I spend most of my free time with them. Why? What have you been reading? And she said, the New York Times. So I sort of thought about it a little while, and I realized that just that the outside world tends to look at the area through a prism of sort of violence, and thinks that it's just sort of people with nothing but bloodthirsty, violent times bent on the destruction of the West. And I kind of, I understood that to a certain extent because my own point of view was shaped by the fact that I did grow up in this oil town in Libya, and it was wholly owned. It was before the revolution. It was wholly owned by the Esso, which was a precursor of Exxon. And I went to Esso Elementary School, and it was sort of like Texas on the Mediterranean. It was a wholly closed environment, and actually Libyans were not allowed to live in the town. They could work there, but they had to be gone by 5 o'clock. And it was sort of 11 square miles, and it was surrounded by a fence, and they had to be outside the fence by 5 o'clock. And I think the mark of our isolation came one morning. Every morning, I always used to listen to the BBC with my father. I'd be eating cornflakes, and he'd be waiting to go to work, and then I'd run across the street to school. And then September 1st, 1969, we turned on the radio, and the first headline was, you know, after the little ditty was, "There's been a coup in Libya." We sort of looked at each other, really? Because there was just no sense in the town that anything had changed because no Libyans lived there. And, you know, as a kid, you really don't have that perspective so much. But after I left, you know, I sort of began to wonder what was on the other side of that fence. And I think that's one of the reasons that I sort of became a reporter, was to go back and explore that question.
You begin your book by saying, when I try to pinpoint the moment when the Middle East began exerting its gravitational pull on my life, I'm usually drawn back to the first diary entry I ever wrote. It was just one sentence, filling an entire page in a small spiral notebook. The war started with booming in Cairo. And you throw down this marker in the book. There's this, you point to the Six-Day War in 1967 as this defining moment and this turning point, and that you go back to it many times in the book as the moment when many things began and many things changed in the region. And so I was hoping you'd tell us.
I mean, well, obviously we didn't know it at the time. I mean, it was just sort of a blip because it was just a 6-day war. And, you know, I was evacuated on an American C-130. And so, of course, my whole perspective was just like I was on an American military plane as a 6-year-old and got to eat sea rations. How thrilling was that? But, you know, for the region, it really was a sort of a traumatic, you know, tectonic shift, just because it was at that moment, you know, because especially because sort of President Nasser of Egypt's whole perspective was that, you know, no voice can be louder than the voice of the struggle of sort of eliminating Israel or defeating Israel. And all through those 6 days, the reports from Radio Cairo was that, you know, they were being pushed back and the Israeli military is being pushed back. And then they ended the 6-day war and they had, you know, they lost East Jerusalem, they lost the Sinai, they lost the Golan Heights, and the sort of small state had defeated all the Arab armies. And so that was sort of the seed kernel of the growth of Islamic fundamentalism in the region, because it was from that point on that people began to question, well, you know, Arab nationalism isn't really working. They've lied to us. You know, it's not this. It's creating this glorious unity, and so that's when. I mean, it had always been there. The Muslim Brotherhood was formed in 1929, so it was sort of, you know, and there were periods right after its formation that was strong. But that's the moment that across the region that really kind of fertilized the effort to turn to Islam and to use it as kind of a political medium to do things that Arab nationalism had failed to do.
In the book, you tell the stories of some remarkable people. I mean, when reading it, I thought that if you probably didn't know the region so well and didn't have the golden key of the language, you probably wouldn't have had access to many of these people. But some of their stories end up being kind of almost metaphors for bigger debates and situations and challenges in the region. And I think specifically to a Jordanian poet that you wrote about, who spent a year in prison after she wrote a poem against the king.
Mir al-Qadha. I'm going to give a long-winded answer here a little bit, just because I want to talk about how I arrived at that point. When I went back as a correspondent, as I said, I was determined to find out what was on the other side of that fence. And as luck would have it, my first assignment, I'd been the bureau chief in Cairo for, I think, 2 weeks, and I got a Libyan visa. And I had been a correspondent for like 9 years in the region for the Associated Press, and I had never gotten a chance to go back and look for my childhood home. So here was this great opportunity. And just as I finished the sort of news task that was bringing me to Libya to report, Gaddafi called a meeting of the popular committees. And he has this conceit that he doesn't really run Libya, that it's run by popular committees. And the popular committees you know, they tend to address social questions, and they do have some power. Like one year he suggested that that they eliminate elementary schools and all mothers teach their children at home. And the sort of outcry from that killed the idea. So I wasn't being very optimistic about it, but you can't, when he calls a meeting like that, there's nothing you can do in Libya because the country closes down because you have to go to the meeting or else you don't get certain permits, you may not be able to leave the country when you want to, et cetera. And there, you know, there's one held in every district, so I went to one in a movie theater, and it turned out to be great because it's the one place when people can really speak their minds. And that year in Libya, what everybody was mad about is that they didn't know what year it was, because Gaddafi had changed the year 3 times in the space of about roughly a year. And he, you know, most Muslims date it, the Hijra calendar, which is when Prophet Muhammad took his followers sort of from Mecca and moved them to Medina, and they marked that as sort of the start of the faith in the community. But Gaddafi decided that they should concentrate more on Prophet Muhammad, so he switched it to his death, you know, counting from his death. And then he said, no, that's not, you know, we should commemorate his birth, not his death. So he moved it back to his birth. So I can't remember exactly what years it was, but it was something like it went from 1429 to 1432 to 1369, all in 1 year. And so event organizers just kind of, you know, threw up their hands and put the date, the Western date, in parentheses, and Libyans just kind of threw up their hands. So I was at this session in Libya, and you know, one woman stood up and she says, why do we have this terrible date system? Why can't we be like the other billion Muslims in the world? Why can't we just be normal? And I thought that was just a great question about, you know, why people, you know, in the region, how do they strive? Well, you know, how do they define normalcy and how do they strive to achieve it? And so it was the question that I most wanted to answer sort of in my reporting, but unfortunately some major events came rolling along, like the invasion of Iraq and sort of all the violence that erupted around al-Qaeda's attacks in Saudi Arabia, et cetera. So I really couldn't focus on that as much as I wanted to. But after I had been there for 4 years, you know, 4 years is sort of usually the end of the tenure, and then my editors came to me and they said, well, you know, if we let you do anything you wanted to do, would you stay for another year? And I said, sure, great. And at that point, I was kind of pessimistic because I had covered so much violence and I had covered so much mayhem that I was beginning to think that you know, the future of the area was probably stunted by this, you know, the lack of progress and the amount of violence. And then, but I said, you know, there's been this policy of the Americans trying to, you know, encourage democratic change and elections, et cetera. So I would like to go to a bunch of different countries and find people that are trying to work on it. I'd like to find 3 people in each country that are trying to affect social and political change. And my editor said, fine. And then I started working on the first country, which was Morocco. And they said, you know what, 3 people is too many. Just find 1 in every country. But, you know, they gave me a month to do it per country. And it was fantastic. And the reason I chose Jordan as an example is sort of, Jordan gets sort of a pass in the West, you know, just because of its political leadership. I mean, first King Hussein was kind of beloved of Western leaders, and now his son, you know, he went to American and British schools, he went to Deerfield Academy, and he went to Sandhurst. He says the right things about Islam. His wife is very attractive. She takes on important causes. And so people kind of don't really look at how Jordan works. But Jordan, like much of the Arab world, is a friend of mine said to me, he said it's an inconspicuous police state because as in most Arab countries, the secret police run everything. And you know, if you want to be an ambassador in Jordan, if you want to be a university professor, if you want to be a newspaper editor, your file has to go to the secret police first, and they sign off on whether or not you're allowed to have that job. And you know, it's something that, this is a long-winded answer, I'm sorry, Roxana, but anyway, it's something that we all run into. I think anybody who's been in the Middle East, and a lot of you have, one of the first words you learn is mukhabarat, which is the word for the secret police. And I met my mukhabarat guy when I was looking for Muhammad Atta's grade school. And he was the sort of evil genius behind the 9/11 attacks, and I went to see his grade school, and I found a few of his teachers, and I was waiting for the driver to circle back to pick me up, and I was standing, sort of looking at the school, thinking about what I had not done, and not looking at my back, and realizing that I'm standing in front of the headquarters of the secret police. And they kind of opened the door and said, "Could you come in here for a second?" So they gave me, you know, they sort of took my ID and they called the press office to make sure I was who I said I was, and then they said, "Okay, you can go." And then, so I stood out there and the car still didn't come, and they were like, opened the door and they said, "You know what, that wasn't quite long enough, come back in." So then I went on like this 2-hour odyssey in the building, and I eventually was ushered into the office of a major, and as I walk in, there's 11 diplomas on the wall behind him from the FBI. And one was for marksmanship, and one was for English, and I happened to notice that one was for interrogation. So as he as he invited me to sit down, I said, "Is this an interrogation?" And he said, "No, it's tea." So we had a fine conversation, but the incredible thing was because I got from that encounter, because he was very polite and he, you know, just wanted to talk about how he was trying to secure the safety of the 5,000 Americans or so in Egypt. But I got a taste of what Egyptians live with a little bit, because whenever I was doing anything in Egypt that he considered dubious, he would call. And you know, you think Big Brother is maybe watching, and well, you found out that Big Brother really was watching. And the one example was we went out, we had heard that mosque preachers in Egypt were beginning to make sort of anti-American statements in the mosques again. So we wanted to find some. So I went out to try and buy them, and the sellers just laughed at me. They wouldn't give me any. So I sent my Egyptian reporter to see if she could have any better luck, and she came back with 2 or 3. And so we're sitting in the office listening to them, and the phone rings, and it's the major, and he says, "What's on the tapes?" And my Egyptian reporter, God bless her, she said, "Go buy your own." But you know, this kind of thing, you know, we can kind of, as a Western reporter, I can brush it off, because although it may be annoying or, you know, a little bit, it makes you a little bit uneasy, it would also work in the other ways too. When we were in situations that were kind of dicey, we were in a village once trying to track down the relatives of someone who had been killed in an Al-Qaeda bombing raid, and we were kind of getting into a bad situation where someone told us they wanted to talk to us inside a dark factory, and so we just were uncomfortable in the situation. So we called the major, because the guy had told us that the secret police headquarters was inside this factory, and he needed permission from them before he could talk to us. And so we called him up, and he said, "No, it's the wrong building. Go somewhere else." And so we got out of there fast. But anyway, Samir al-Qudaa is the poem in Jordan. And I met Samir. Samir was an interesting guy, because he is a civil engineer by day and he's a poet by night. And he had written a poem for the annual meeting of Jordanian dentists. But it was a political poem. And he talked in it about freedom of speech in the Middle East. And he said, you know, when he calls it the manager, when he means the leader of the country, when the manager makes a speech, we're allowed to clap or not clap, and that is freedom of speech in our country. And he was accused of slandering the king, and it's a great word in Arabic. It's italat lisan, which is the lengthening of the tongue. And he got a year in jail for that one poem. And I think, you know, you just come back to that all the time, and that, you know, sort of the secret police in those countries control everything, and the leaders, even someone who sort of seems progressive on the outside, like King Abdullah, they find it much easier to strengthen the hand of the secret police than they do to sort of seek popular legitimacy. And as long as that happens, it's very difficult to change the political systems.
I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm sure everyone here has loads of questions. But it's very interesting, because throughout your book we encounter very interesting individuals who or communities who engage in very interesting acts of civil disobedience. And one of them is, being an Iranian, the one I picked up on is this story of the dogs in Iran, which I love, and I love that you picked up on it.
There's this great thing in Iran, you know, because Friday is, of course, the day off, and everyone is supposed to go to communal prayers. And so when you're there on Saturday, they do this kind of prayer roundup of what all the sermons were in all the mosques all over the country. And so I was there on a Saturday and was just sort of flipping through them with Nazila, who's the reporter who works for the New York Times there, and she, you know, pointed out there was one about dogs. And there was sort of this he was in a provincial city. There was a prayer leader at the main mosque in a provincial city, and he was railing about dogs. And the line, if I remember it correctly, was that the soldiers who had died in the Iran-Iraq war were doubly blessed, because not only had they died for a cause that would take them straight to heaven, but also they didn't live long enough to see the time in Iran where women wear hats and men carry dogs. And he was talking about the fact that some women were trying to replace the veil with baseball caps. So I started to ask questions about what's going on with dogs, and it turns out that because the Islamic Republic considers that it is building a perfect Islamic state, and there are a bunch of references in the Quran to the that dogs are ritually unclean, that you shouldn't own them. And the great thing about Iran is that you can there are all these establishments that they've set up. And so we were in the holy city of Qom, and I was looking through religious books about what they said about dogs, and they all basically, there's a list of 10 horrible things that you can do, and one was drink alcohol, and one was adultery, and one was own a dog. But next door was this Quran research center, and so you walk in and you front desk, and it's like, what's your query? And they say, well, what is the Quran and what are the hadiths, sort of the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, say about dogs? And so they put it in the computer, and the answers all come whirring out, and they happily give it to you. And so there was, I think there were only like 2 in the Quran itself, and it was about that they can be loyal and they can be guard dogs, etc. But there are about 435 or so in the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, which are sort of disputed because no one really knows whether he actually said them, or whether, in later years, people who needed sort of political expediency would come up with a saying that they hope would be incorporated into the official the official record of what Muhammad said. So anyway, so then I started asking Iranians about it, and it turns out that because these official fatwas rolled out every 2 years ago, so that you shouldn't own dogs, that people thought, well, this is how I'll stick it to the government. I'm going to own a dog and just show them what I think of their Islamic traditions. But that also meant that there was a great shortage of dogs for people who wanted to own them in Iran. So I went around talking to them, and I met this woman in North Tehran, which is sort of the richer part of town, and she had a big black poodle that she'd taken for a walk, and it sort of got from me to the corner of that room away from her, and along comes a motorcycle with 2 guys on it, and the guy in the back zips down and takes the dog and disappears. She was dog napped. But she was a smart woman, and she figured that it would probably show up in the animal bazaar. And there's this wonderful section of the Tehran bazaar, which goes on for kilometer and kilometer. But there's one section where they sell animals. So I went down there she went down there and she got her poodle back, and sure enough, it was for sale there. And so I went down there, and I don't know what section of London they sell drugs in, but there's a part, when you're wandering around New York, there's certain parts of town when you walk through, or at least before Giuliani, where sort of drug dealers would come up and whisper in your ear, and it was like that. I'd get out of the car, and people see that I'm a foreigner, and they assume I'm looking for a dog, and they'd come up and they'd whisper in my ear, got a dog, I got a dog, you want to buy a dog? Or a few of them were more specific. One guy came up and said, I got a German Shepherd, you want a German Shepherd? And as it was, I was standing there when a municipal dog, like a dog catcher, came along, and I asked him, I said, well, can you own a dog here? Is it legal? And he said, yes, no problem, as long as you have the paper and as long as you have the shots and everything. It's, dogs are legal in the Islamic Republic just like everywhere else in the world. And at which point a man in the crowd who had been listening stepped forward and said, you're a liar. And he had this papers with me. He said, I have all my registered, I have all the things for my dog, and you took it away anyway. And then he began to throttle the man to the point that the police had to intervene. And in the mayhem, the person standing next to me turned to me quietly and he said, there are no laws for the way they take away dogs in the Islamic Republic, just like people.
Yeah. I'm wondering if there are any questions. Just wait for the microphone to get to you.
Bari Alamuddin, Al Hayat newspaper.
Hi.
Hi. I just want, I have a few questions, so I hope you bear with me. I just wanted to find out from you as a reporter and as a journalist, who's really responsible for this image about the Arabs in the States in particular? because I suffer from this and I've witnessed it myself. Is it actually ignorance or is it a conspiracy like we'd like to think in the Middle East, mainly by Zionists? So I would like a straight answer, please. Thank you very much. Also, I'm intrigued by the title of the book, and I wonder if you can tell us a bit about your experiences in Lebanon, if you have any. As a Lebanese, I'm interested. Thank you very much.
Sure. I don't think you can assign blame to anybody. I was writing a story about an Iranian the other day, and he said, of course we all believe in conspiracy theories, but that's because we live in a part of the world where there are conspiracies. I don't think, I think as a reporter, I always found that I was given fairly free rein to write about what I wanted to write about. But it's just that, violence makes headlines. And so when there's a lot of it, you have to, you have to cover that. I mean, I made a determined effort. I didn't want to be the correspondent in the, covering the Israel-Palestine struggle, even though you get on the front page a lot more, just because I felt like that was overcovered, that it was given too much attention, and you just had to spend more time in, far corners of the Arab world reporting about what was going on in those countries, and that was ultimately more interesting. But it's a difficult, it's a difficult argument. It's a fine argument to make in peacetime, and editors are great. I love that idea. But as soon as the tide changes, then you have to struggle with it a little bit. And I think it's the one argument that I had that I lost on coverage, because they usually left it up to me, and they said, you can write whatever you want. And then I was working on this great project in Egypt because I was trying to figure out why the Americans, after pouring so much, so many billions of dollars into aid in Egypt, were not terribly loved. So I was looking for people that had gotten aid to see how they were doing, and I'd been working on it for months, and I'd finally sort of narrowed it down to one project, and I'd also found a group of doctors who were willing to let me sort of hang around with them. And then somebody blew up, I'm going to forget the name of the tanker, but the French oil tanker off the coast of Yemen. And I just was, there was just one person killed, and it made a blip on oil prices, and I was just sort of like, I don't want to go, I want to stick with my project. And they just said, I'm sorry, it's, if people are going to start blowing up tankers on the high seas, it has to be covered. You just have to go. And I mean, I think that's the issue in the region, is that there just is a lot of violence, and it is news, and you have no choice but to cover it, and it tends to overshadow everything else. So as much as you would like to sort of wrestle against it, it's very hard to overcome. As to the title, it's actually, they did wish me a happy birthday. When you work in Lebanon and you work in areas that Hezbollah has an interest in, or where they, predominate, if you don't have permission from their security services to work there, they materialize rather fast and take away, if a cameraman goes into the southern suburbs of Beirut and raises a camera, you'd think there's no security around, and they are there in seconds. And so you have to go fill out a bunch of paperwork, and they ask you what you studied in college. It's like 5 pages of paperwork, and they ask you what you studied in college, where you were born, and one of them is your birth date. And I think I did it in March, and I forgot all about it. And then I opened my email on August 6th, which is my birthday, and there was an email from Hizbollah@hezbollah.org. And it's a little poem. It's in chapter 3, if you want. And there's a little poem from Hezbollah about wishing me a happy birthday. So that's how the title came about. I mean, I talk a lot about Lebanon in the book, because I obviously, a lot of my friends are Lebanese, and I have a lot of affection for the place. And I think it's interesting because I got to spend a certain amount of time with Fairuz, who of course is a famous singer, and she sort of talks about how her songs have become this image for Lebanese who live outside the country of this sort of idyllic village life that probably never existed, but because they want to idealize it, that they love the music because they think of this sort of fantasy of what Lebanon should be like, and when she first became popular was that period when Lebanon was really becoming the cosmopolitan crossroads that some Lebanese would like it to become again. And then there's sort of this alternative reality of Hezbollah being much more muscular and nationalistic, and they haven't lost entirely that cosmopolitan ideal, but they've certainly taken it in another direction. And there's sort of a constant tension in Lebanon within that about what the future is going to look like, which side is going to sort of predominate.
I think there's a gentleman. Oh, it's answered already. Okay. The lady in the back and then you, sir.
Hello,
Hi.
I'm Cynthia Patrick. In 2004, I was sent to Beirut to open the office for Danish Refugee Council. And when I arrived there, a friend told me, "Oh, you're alone to set up an NGO here. The first thing you should do is read Alice in Wonderland." And when I read it, it helped me, to cope with a lot of things. And I wanted to know if you have, because this I think is applicable everywhere in the Middle East, if you have like secret tips to cope with what is completely crazy in the Middle East and at the same time makes it charming. But, if you would take everything seriously, you would be completely mad, as they also say in Alice.
I think that, the day that you can no longer laugh about that kind of stuff is the day that you should come home. And I think that actually happened to me because it was in Iran that I had one of those moments. And the Iranians, you just never know when you're going to get a visa and when you're not going to get a visa. And, sometimes you get it, and then you'll write something that you had no idea. I mean, they didn't like the dog story, so that kept me out of there for 18 months. But there was during the Iraq invasion, the Americans' newspapers were all trying to figure out how to get into Kurdistan because everybody thought that the 101st Airborne was going to head south to Baghdad from Kurdistan. And the Turks said absolutely no journalists across the border. The Syrians said absolutely no journalists across the border. And a few individuals would get on sheep trucks and smuggle themselves through, but the networks really can't because they have a lot of satellite equipment. So their only route was through Iran. And so in all these countries, there's a foreign press office that deals with us that sort of gives you permission to come in and come out and issue visas. And the man who ran it in Iran said, "Well, I'll try and make some money. I'll set the visa price to come in and go up to Kurdistan at an outrageous price of $5,000 for a visa, and maybe I'll make a little money." And so the American networks were like, $5,000? We'll have 10. And so the man who ran the press office suddenly realized that he could mint money on this thing. So instead of him issuing visas, he sort of instantly privatized the whole process, and he got his college roommate to run Press Services Incorporated. I've forgotten what the exact name was, but anyway, everything you had to do would go through him. And we fought and fought and fought not to use this system because we had been coming in and out of Iran for a while, but they just said, if you're not going to use it, you can't come in. So I finally made a trip there with the foreign editor, and we brought her in to negotiate. And we negotiated this compromise where anything we were dealing with the government, we would use him. He would make the appointments, they would do it, we would pay for that. And then anything dealing not with the government, we would use our old system, and we could use our own translator, and we could use our own system. And so they were fine with that, and the foreign editor went home, and I stayed for another 2 weeks. And then I went in on the second to last day to pay for our government services, and he sat down and he presented me a bill for just a little under $8,000. It was like $7,900 for services rendered. And it was just, I couldn't believe it, and because they'd gotten used to the fact that networks would pay anything. And so I went down the list, and one day they had called Ibrahim Yazdi, who's the head, he's sort of the perennial opposition figure in Iran, and he, was a supporter of Khomeini at the time of the revolution, but he's a surgeon, he was trained at Baker Medical School in Houston, Texas, so he speaks wonderful English. And I had interviewed him scores of times because I'd been in and out of the country for 15 years. So all I had to do was pick up the phone and call him, but because I had agreed to do this new system, I had let them make the interview. And so they had charged me for a translator, and they had charged me for the phone call, and it was a bill for like $400 for one day, because any time you did something for them for one day, boom, $400. So I looked at that bill and I just said, I'm not paying it. And there ensued this unbelievable marathon bargaining session, and they said that they would take away the press card from our stringer there if we didn't pay it until she paid it, and it went on and on and on, and it went on for like 4 hours, and I got it down to about $4,500. And as I was walking out, the photographer who worked with me, he turned to me and he said, Neil, don't you think you could have been a little bit diplomatic? And that was the point that I realized that, yes, I had fallen down the rabbit hole and was no longer amused to be there. So I think that those kind of situations, you kind of have to roll with it, and you have to realize that you are in a different part of the world and they have a different way of doing business. And as long as it, that it has an entertainment value and eventually you get what you want, you just have to accept it. And when you start railing against it, it's time to go home because, it'll drive you crazy.
There's a question here.
Yes, I wonder if you could comment about the difference in coverage about the release of the accused Lockerbie bomber in Scotland a few years ago between the British media and the U.S. As you probably know, The Guardian and various events that happened here have more or less asserted that he was a fall guy and not the real person. And I'm just curious how the New York Times covered this at the time and other U.S. media, if you...
Do you mean when he was just released to go back to Libya now?
Yes, recently, the recent
Or
release.
the original trial?
Well, I mean, the furor over him being released in the United States and how the difference in reporting this and the history of his trial and everything in the U.S. compared to here in England.
I'll answer to the extent that I know, because the problem with working in the Middle East is and especially in the age before the internet, and especially when you're running around, I don't always have time to read everybody's coverage. I have a sense of it, but I haven't done it chapter and verse. And I just think, again, in the United States, there is more of a history of confrontation with, Gaddafi, and Reagan called him the mad dog of the Middle East, and sort of before the Iranians came along, the Libyans were kind of the enemy of choice. And so there is a tendency to sort of paint, to sort of revive that at any time. And I think the Lockerbie, bombing was an example of that. And I think, there were questions about whether it was just convenient to accuse them, and there were questions whether the Syrians had possibly done it because of the whole Berlin nightclub episode. And I think that I think that also there's a huge, not a huge, but there's a very vocal lobby of Lockerbie parents in the United States, and I think that they're much more vocal than the group here. And it's not all the parents, but it's a certain number of them, and they put a lot of pressure on Congress not to accept what the Libyans are saying, not to negotiate the compensation deal. And so there are just a lot more voices condemning the Libyan government and the Libyan, and Gaddafi and the regime there. And that's why I think the coverage tends to be a lot more negative than it is here. Although, I mean, the British also had their own, episodes with the policewoman being shot from the Libyan embassy. So I think it exists here. But I just think the drumbeat is sort of more sustained in the United States on that issue.
Here and then back there and then there.
Hi, I'm Pune from PTV. You mentioned on the cover of your book the changing Middle East, and then you mentioned in several places how the new generation of rulers of Arab countries and Middle Eastern countries, when each one of them comes into power, you have new hopes for a change in the Middle East. How has that worked out? Because then you don't seem very hopeful about it later.
Yeah, it's sort of, one of the things, as I sort of said I wanted to spend time with my editors sort of looking at the people trying to affect political and social change. And I I was pessimistic going into it, and I was kind of optimistic coming out of it because the people that I did meet were so strong and so interesting and so committed to what they were doing against admittedly terrible odds. And you know, I had worked there. I started working in the Middle East as a reporter. I mean, I was there as a student learning the language in the early 1980s, and then I was there in the late 1980s with the Associated Press. So I had seen that older generation, and so I had heard the sort of mantra for years that when the younger generation comes in, because they had studied in the West and because they'd been exposed to sort of more open systems, that they would be more willing to change and indeed push change. And I think probably one of my best and first hints at it was when when they changed in when President Hafez al-Assad died in Syria and his son came in. His son was 34, and the Constitution said you had to be 40, and so they changed the Constitution to say, well, you had to be 34 to be president. And in he swept. And so I went to talk to the American ambassador, and I said, well, you know, what about this? You know, he spent time in London, and you know, and he said, yeah, he's an ophthalmologist. He spent a lot of time in London studying ophthalmology and not much else. And it sort of proved to be prescient because he didn't really change things. And, you know, I think there's been a disappointment because there's a whole generation of kings. They're in Morocco, Bahrain, or leaders, Syria, who all came in at about the same time. And everybody, you know, they sort of all made the right noises about political change and opening up the systems. And then when they figured out what it would cost them, you know, they put on the brakes. And one of the great lines about that is I spent a lot of time in Bahrain with this young guy in his 20s, he's just turned 30, but who sort of had opened the first website and the first sort of online venue for people in Bahrain to air their political views. And when the king came back, I think it was in 1999, if I'm remembering correctly, and he said, we're going to have a democracy in Bahrain that is ariq, which means deeply rooted. And when he heard that, you know, the blogger had been kind of secret. He hadn't used his own name for 2 years, and so he released his own name and he said who he was. And then I met him I met him right at that point, and then you know, when I went and spent time with him for the bits that appear in the book, he'd been at it 5 years, and he said, well, I finally figured out that when in the Middle East they say there's going to be a constitutional monarchy, it means the monarch writes the Constitution.
We've got the lady back there, and then a gentleman over here, and then we'll come back to. We've got 3 questions here.
Hi, I'm Duria. I'm a publisher for business reports. I just wanted to ask about Gaddafi. Why do we only hear one side of the story when it's a fact that actually American companies won like 90% of the tenders rolled out by the government, and also that there is an increased trade volume actually coming in and out of the Middle East to, or actually the Middle East will be partly responsible to increase or to double the trade volume going out of the United States. So hence, the Middle East will play a very important role. And if Gaddafi is the mad dog of the Middle East, why are we doing business with Libya in such an extent? I mean, 90% of the government tenders, the country is being rebuilt as we speak, and you can imagine what kind of sums are actually flowing back to the US from Libya. And this is just a side of the story, I think, not being mentioned. And in regards to Syria, there is a certain democracy model we have in mind, but we need to keep in mind that in the Middle East, there's a different kind of educational level. So you had democratic elections, for instance, in Palestine, and you had a very, you know, quite fanatic, or as you label it, a terrorist organization, won the elections. I think in order to kind of promote democracy, we need to lay out a fundamental education level for the public. And then I mean, Syria could be quite happy because obviously he studied abroad. he's.
Sorry, can I just ask you, because you
Yes.
have a lot of questions.
Sure.
Do you have a question? If you ask a question,
Well,
then
the
you
question
can
was
answer.
actually why the other side was.
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by the other side. You mean that the fact that there's a lot of American business being done, and yeah, it comes out. And I think that with this gentleman's point earlier, I mean, a lot of people made the point that the reason that release came about was because people want contracts, with the Libyan government. But I think that I after I wrote the story about that woman standing up at the meeting and saying, why can't we just be normal? The Libyans didn't let me back in because they said that I had mocked Libyan democracy. But I think that the point is that in all these countries, there are people that are perfectly capable of running the country and who should get a chance to voice their opinions, and they don't. Gaddafi has been a repressive leader since the day he came in, and he's been in there for 40 years. And there's a lot of very smart, well-educated Libyans that would love the chance to air their political views. And when they try, they end up in jail. And the same thing is true in Syria. And I talk about that a lot in the book. I don't think that has been the American government's policy in terms of pushing, especially in the Bush administration, of sort of jumping from zero to elections. And I don't think it works because there isn't a tradition, and there hasn't been one for 50 years or longer, of civil society. And you can't go from nothing to elections until you give space for that civil society to develop. And I think all those countries have the people who, given the chance, would develop it. But first, they have to be given the chance.
I think in the book you talk a lot about specific to American foreign policy, but I think recommendations to all of the West for their engagement with the region. You talk a lot about the rule of law and support to dissidents, and support to initiatives to build up civil rights and the right to free speech, and so it's very interesting because there is quite a bit of the book that's very prescriptive in a way, in terms of how we can find a way to engage more constructively.
And I'm occasionally accused of being naive on this front or simplistic, but I just think that it's sort of gotten so far away from sort of any kind of, maybe realistic is too strong a word, but it's just gotten so far away from sort of the basic building blocks of the kind of thing for civil society that you kind of have to start over policy at a simpler level in terms of supporting principles. And the United States says they do it in terms of like elections or freedom of speech and things like that, but they only really speak out about, say, dissidents jailed in Syria, or when Ayman Noor, who started a political party in Egypt. And Ayman was a kind of incredible example because he was not, he wasn't Nelson Mandela, it wasn't a figure that people look up to. He was sort of, no one quite knew what the real estate dealings he did, which earned him his money to start a political party, were. But he started a political party against terrible odds in Egypt. And he really got sort of upper middle class and middle class young Egyptians interested in the political process. He'd have his political rallies in fancy hotels, and so they would come, and they were really interested in the politics of the country in a way that they hadn't been for generations. I mean, just there's a lot of dinosaurs running political parties in Egypt, and so nothing ever changes because Mubarak doesn't change. So all the people in the opposition party say, well, we don't have to move on either because look, he's there. And so the young kind of get shut out. And Ayman Noor brought them back into the process. And of course, as soon as the election was over, they threw him in jail on charges of, faking the signatures on his ballots. And, the United States, whenever they wanted to bring pressure on Egypt over something, they would bring up the case of Ayman Noor, but they didn't do it consistently. And I think that is a flaw in American policy. They shouldn't endorse individual candidates because who's the United States or any outsider to say, this guy's a good guy. And, the opinion of Americans has sunk so low that sort of endorsing them is the kiss of death anyway. But I think that you have to, push the principle. And no, Lebanon's a perfect example. They pick and choose about who they like there. And when was the last time? I mean, Syria. In Syria, the opposition parties got together a few years ago, and they kind of elected a council of opposition members, and they made a woman the head of it. And I think there's 12 of them, and all of them ended up in jail. And when was the United States kind of thinks that, well, Syria, we might be able to influence them to do something about Hezbollah, we might be able to pull them away from the Iranian orbit, and so they don't really speak up about, dissidents in Syria. Now, admittedly, do the dissidents have any power in Syria? No. But I think you have to be consistent about sort of standing up for the principles. And there are people in these countries. I mean, the guy in the book, you talked about the rule of law. There was an incredible man I met named Ahmed Marzouki in Morocco. And Ahmed had been, a young Moroccan from a village without any money in 1970, and so he did what a lot of people did, and he went into the army. And he was ordered by his officers to go on a live fire exercise, and they threw all these young recruits off a truck on a golf course and said, open fire. And it turned out to be a coup attempt, and the people they were firing on was the king's golfing friends. But they missed the king, and so the leaders of the coup were executed on Moroccan TV live, and these sort of 58 young men were sent to the courts, and they got 5 years apiece for participating in it. And just as the sentences were being handed down, the Air Force in 1972 tried to shoot down the king's plane. This was King Hassan, and so he was furious. And so he just built a prison in the desert, and he threw those 58 men into the prison. And, they disappeared. And, you have a constitution in Morocco, you have a legal system that on paper is supposed to work, but in actuality it does not, because the king can override it anytime he wants to. And so, the men, they were thrown into this prison. They got like 4 loaves of bread and 3 liters of water for 58 men. They gradually began to die off. They never were allowed outside. They never got medical care. And, gradually, because it was a warning to the military, basically, because the military knew about it. It was like, if you undertake a coup, this is what your fate is going to be. And, some of the guards were so appalled that they told the families, and so the families started to try and agitate, but it was kind of impossible until finally, about 15 years after they were first incarcerated, the daughter of one of them came in among the top 10 students in Morocco in the high school exam that they all have to take. And the top 10 students get to meet the king. And so at the end of the audience with these high school seniors, he said, is there anything I can do for any of you? And the girl was very brave, and she said, yeah, when are you going to release my father from Tazmamart, which is the name of the prison? And the king calmly turned to an aide, and he said, is anybody still alive in Tazmamart? But that sort of started the outcry, and then they came out. And the man I met, Ahmed Marzouki, he's now, he's in his probably late 50s, and he's not bitter about what happened to him. He just wants to sort of take it and turn it into a positive experience for the country. And he said, I'm a living, breathing example of why we should have the rule of law. And so we need, a curb on the power of the monarchy. We need an independent judiciary. We need police supervision, and we need civil rights. We need to be able to speak out. And, I think that people like him are really important for change in the region, because he's lived the experience, he can talk about it, and he wants to do something about it. And, there are people like that in virtually every Middle Eastern country, and, they're the hope for change, because it's not going to be done by outsiders.
The gentleman in the back.
Steve Crawshaw, until recently,
Hi, Steve.
Hi. Until recently, Human Rights Watch in New York, and now just moving to Amnesty International. I wanted to ask you a question about Iran and your thoughts on that moving forward. I know that at the time of last year's elections, you were already in New York, but I think you were following it from afar then. 2 questions, really. One is about perceptions. How much do you think that Western perceptions changed on seeing what the people of Iran were doing? How much do you think that broke down senses of kind of identifying Iranians with their government, as it were? But more importantly, moving forward, do you think what happened last year during the summer and autumn of last year was a kind of a blip, and that the lid has now been put on that? Or how much do you think that story is still unfolding and or untold? What's your kind of crystal ball, or either crystal ball going forward, or how you see things at the moment?
Yeah, nobody wins any prizes predicting what's going to happen in Iran. I think that it did change people's perceptions. I mean, unfortunately, through horrible things like the film of Netta, the woman being, shot. And I think that kind of stark image really does shock people, and they kind of take a look at countries in a way that they hadn't before. I mean, Iran's reputation is not the greatest in the United States just because of the long history since the hostage crisis, but I think around the world that really kind of, brought, that shocked people, and they were willing to sort of see what was going on there. And I think, the Iranians themselves who are involved in the movement have no idea where it's going. And we just saw Mousavi speak out again, around the new year and kind of push back by giving the new year a name before the supreme leader did. He met with some opposition figures a week or so ago and said, that he was going to continue his opposition. But I think the thing that's difficult to predict, and you don't see this only in Iran, is that the protest movement, to an extent, it's a social phenomenon that started on the web, and in Iran more than anywhere else. But you saw it in some places too. The Iranians hate it when you compare them to like Egypt because it's an Arab country. But I'm going to do it anyway. It's really hard to take those social movements online and move them onto the streets. A, just for the organizational effort, and B, because of the brutality of the regimes against them. And I just did an article about a man who's trying to push nonviolent resistance in Iran because he thinks that if you get mass protests who engage in nonviolence, then it'll eventually push back against the regime. But the problem with that model is when the government is using live fire, how do you how do you face that down? And I don't think anybody has the answer. And in Iran, I don't think they have the model yet. They haven't figured out, how strong a leadership they need. I don't think the leaders themselves have exactly figured out how far they want to take it. In the last round of this, when it was still done within the electoral process, Khatami was very reluctant to call people out on the streets because he knew it was going to be, they were going to get killed. But at the same time, he wouldn't confront the sort of opposition at all. I mean, he wouldn't confront the hardliners at all. And so, in a way, they got their way eventually. So I don't think it was I think it's going to be a roller coaster ride for a while. I don't think it was a blip that's going to go away, because I think there is deep-seated desire for change in that country. It's a very young country, as everybody knows. The population. Most of them didn't experience the time before the revolution, and they want to be more connected to the world. But I just, it took the Soviet Union 70 years to fall apart just because the repressive organs were so strong. And I think you have an equally repressive system there. And how long, and they have oil, so they have a source of income. So how long it's going to take to push is impossible to predict.
Rula, here.
I want to go back to the...
Can you speak up a little bit? I just can't quite hear you.
Yeah, I think it's not working. Anyway.
And can you also tell us who you are?
Okay. I just want to ask about these people that you describe as agents of change in their countries. If you think, were they motivated by the Bush policy on democratic change, or how did you connect the two of them?
Yeah, no, they weren't. I mean, most of them, their work certainly predates the Bush policy, and I think, I think people in their own countries, they want to live better lives. They want better lives for their children. They want better education for their children. So they're not really motivated by outsiders. I think the way, I think what Bush did, and the American administration, by speaking out about it, it makes the governments a little bit hesitant to crack down. Not always. If they think they're really in danger, they don't really care what the Americans think. But if there are, and I'm not saying just the Americans, I mean, it can be anybody. But no, even in Egypt, they really, that first round of parliamentary elections in 2005, one of the reasons was it was so free is because there had been a lot of statements from outside saying, why doesn't Egypt have free elections? And, so the first round, they kind of stayed back, And then when the Muslim Brotherhood won 88 seats, it was like, okay, that's enough free elections, forget it. But I mean, I think, you know, there's one woman in the book, there's a Saudi woman, Fawzia al-Bakr, and she's a professor of education. And she's one of the bravest people I've ever met. And she, you know, was educated abroad. She got her PhD, and she went back to Saudi Arabia to teach at a university. And she got there in October of, or November, she got back in 1990. And I think 3 days after she got back, there was a women's driving demonstration because the women in Saudi Arabia were particularly upset that they couldn't drive under the conditions of war. And so they wanted to make the point that, you know, if the Iraqi army was going to come over the border from Kuwait, they wanted to be allowed to drive. And so she got in her car and she drove, and they were all arrested. And she was a university professor, and, you know, they went to work the following Monday. And by that time, the mosques had, you know, lit up with mosque preachers saying that, you know, they were non-Muslims and whores and everything else who had been educated abroad, and that's why they were trying to undermine the Islamic system. And she, you know, showed up at her door, and her nameplate at the university, and her nameplate had been torn off, and Kafra, infidel, had been written there. And, you know, for 15 years, by the time I met her, you know, it had been reverberating through her career that she had taken part in this demonstration, and she had never quite been forgiven. You know, she hadn't been on government panels and things like that. And she, you know, said, if you told me 15 years ago when I was in that demonstration that I wouldn't have been able to affect change, I would have called you a liar. But she was still struggling. And I think, you know, she was interesting because she was a professor of education. And so she had 4 kids. And, you know, she had sent her kid to Quran class. And, you know, he came back. And after a while, he wouldn't look his father in the face. And you know, so they sort of sat the kid 6. And it's like, why won't you look to your father? Why won't you talk to your father? And he said, well, you know, Daddy shaves, and the man in Quran class says anybody who shaves is an infidel. And, you know, and then so she started like looking into textbooks and, you know, sort of seeing what the content both inside and outside the school was of the religious education. And she started a fight saying there's just too much religion in the curriculum. They're teaching them things, you know, you're not teaching kids how to think, you're teaching them, you know, how to ride a camel to go seek knowledge in China, you know, all these sayings that were incorporated in religion that she didn't believe in. So, you know, when the Americans came along after 9/11 and said you have to change your curriculum because it's you know, it's creating extremism, then the Saudi religious authority, which runs the education system, said, you know, it's a cultural attack, they're trying to make us Western, they hate Islam, etc. And you know, Fawzia's point was, you know, or the point that I made to Fawzia that she sort of agreed with me on, is like, if you're going to attack an education system, you know, listen to what Saudi parents are saying. Just don't come in there, you know, pushing your way in, but see what the opposition on the ground is and try and echo that. And, you know, because Saudi parents are asking, why aren't our kids fit for jobs when they get out of the system? You know, why isn't there more science? Why aren't there scientific experiments? And it had nothing to do with the Bush administration. You know, she had been concerned about it long before. But if you're going to raise those kind of points, you should raise it in a way that helps the people in the country, you know, in their struggle. So if you're going to raise the point about the education system, you don't say you're turning out extremists. You say, you know, the policymakers outside could say, why isn't the Saudi education system turning out more scientists? Why isn't it turning out, you know, more people that can contribute to the society? So anyway,
what did you think about these people?
I thought those people.
What do they think, in your view, of the Bush policy?
I mean, I thought they were great. Because you know, the odds are terrible, and they're very brave, and they're willing to dedicate their lives to changing a system and making their countries better in a way that, you know, this woman has been fighting for the right to drive for 15 years, and she's still going to keep fighting for it. And you know, in every country, you know, Ahmed Marzouki in Morocco, you know, is going to keep fighting. You know, he was given the choice to testify to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he said no. because there's only Truth and Reconciliation Commission on one side. They're not bringing the torturers out. They're not bringing the people out. You know, and the king had made this big deal about it, and he was willing to sort of confront the system and say, this is half-hearted. We need to keep fighting until we get a wholehearted change. And I just think, you know, I think people like that should be supported in any way you can. And I think, you know, obviously there was a certain amount of ambiguity about the Bush policy from people like that, because he was visiting a lot of violence upon the Middle East with the invasion of Iraq, and just in general, and also the switches. You know, I mean, Condoleezza Rice gave a very famous speech at the University of Cairo, American University in Cairo in 2005, and she said, you know, for 60 years we have supported stability at the expense of democracy, and we've achieved neither, and it's going to change. And then they started pushing the elections, and you know, as soon as Hamas won in Gaza, it was like, oh, well, maybe we don't want elections. You know, so people were sort of skeptical that the Americans were really committed to doing something to change their lives as opposed to pursuing American interests. I had an interesting conversation with a woman who's also in the book from Morocco, who ran a shelter for battered women. And she said, you know, when we first sort of, we were against the invasion of Iraq, we were really kind of opposed to the Bush policies in the Middle East. So at one point, we sat down and we said, you know, we're not going to take any more American money. And there was a sort of a movement among Moroccan NGOs to stop taking any American money. And then she said, you know, and then I thought about it, and I thought, that's kind of ridiculous, because not all Americans support President Bush, and there are women's organizations in the United States who are trying to fight for the same thing that we're fighting for, you know, that for a battered women's shelter, for the right to divorce, for the right to an alimony, and, you know, they agree with us. So, you know, so she spent a little bit more time researching the kind of organizations that were giving her money, and as long as she felt like that they were on the same wavelength in terms of goals and aims, she would accept the money, but she wouldn't, you know, take it as sort of a blanket, anything, you know, any outside donation is good.
Okay, Greg, I see you, but I also want to see if there are any questions on this side of the room, because I don't want to, okay, here, and then to you, back to you.
This might be a slightly naive question because I'm not trained.
We love naive questions.
Well, I'm not trained as a journalist, so it might be. How do you handle your Western values when you're interacting with people in the Middle East? Do you consciously sort of choke back and not be judgmental, kind of from that perspective, or do you kind of just, what the hell, you know, I'm a Westerner?
It kind of, you know, I mean, people always ask me that, like, what was my reception as an American? And it's always been excellent in the Middle East. I mean, they are an incredibly hospitable people, and they have always been incredibly welcoming to me. The one exception was 2003, because at that point, people who turned on their TV sets, you know, every night they saw sort of American tanks rolling across Iraq and American soldiers busting into Iraqi homes. And so then people were a little bit, then I was holding back a little bit because people were hostile. But they were never, I mean, compared to the hostility that journalists faced in Iraq, it was nothing. But, you know, it would affect your mood, because Egyptians love to banter, you know, when you talk to them, sit down in a restaurant, where are you from, are you married, how many kids do you have, stuff like that. And so the first question was always, where are you from? And as soon as you said American, boom, the banter would stop, and they would, you know, turn cold at this particular period. And so then I'd say I'm from New York, because it took them a minute or two to figure, you know, they'd start talking to me and say, wait, New York, he's an American, and then they would come down. And people would throw things at me in the street, etc. My favorite, though, was I broke a tooth in Saudi Arabia, and it just snapped right off at like 10 o'clock at night. So I had to go to the first dentist available at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I got a Syrian. And I said, where did you study? And he said, the University of Aleppo. And I was like, well, that's great. It's a beautiful city, one of my favorite cities in the Middle East. Where'd you go after that? He said, nowhere. I said, no. After you finished your dentistry school in Aleppo, you know, did you study in Montreal? Did you study in Paris? He said, no, the school in Aleppo is really good. I'm racking my brains thinking if I've ever been to the dentistry school at the University of Aleppo. And I hadn't. He said, why? Where are you from? And he's like fiddling with his instruments on his tray and stuff. And I said, New York. And he said, really? An American? That's not a very popular thing to be. Open wide. But on a more serious note, I mean, the answer to your question, I mean, it became a lot harder, you know, because you would try and, you know, sort of frame your question in terms of American values. And after, you know, sort of Abu Ghraib came along, you know, they would just throw that kind of stuff right back in your face and say, what are you talking about, you know, no torture, what are you talking about? And, you know, it was a real blow. And you know, everything about it was just wrong. And, but I think, and it's also, you know, it comes back to the point that I was trying to make about Fawzia al-Bakr, like when outsiders try, or the American policymakers try and talk about change in the Middle East, they say, well, we're going to bring you freedom and democracy. And freedom and democracy are not necessarily words that resonate in the Middle East. It's not necessarily values that they have. And, you know, if you talk to people in the Middle East, they'll talk about justice and dignity, which is more or less the same thing, but it's not, you know, their vocabulary. So if you talk about freedom and democracy, it's like, I don't know what that is. They say they're bringing democracy to Iraq, and look what a mess that is. I don't want to be part of that. But, you know, if it's justice and dignity, they'll say, well, you know, those are values that I have. I want to be part of building that. So, you know, it is really important how you frame the conversation. So in talking to them, you know, I would always just try and see what their goals are, you know, as opposed to how they necessarily worded it.
Marie?
I can't hear you, Marie.
Hi, Marie Calvin, Sunday Times. As you know, I love everything you write, and I'm interested in everything you write.
I know
But
some of your
something you just
secrets,
said
Marie.
really struck a spark. I said, oh, look at what's happening in Iraq. And I was in Iraq covering the election. It's the only election I have covered in the Middle East where we did not know who was going to win. That's a shocker. So, and I'm of two minds, and I really would like to hear what you want to say about it, because we didn't know who was going to win. No one knew who was going to win. The Iraqis didn't know who were going to win. They walked to the poll booth voting in Iraq. It was not a fake election. I'm not entirely sure if maybe the Palestinians, but it was moving. People dressed as if they were going to their first communion. They really cared about it. Tell me what you think about our American, Western idea of. Tell me what you think about that Iraqi election. Just
Well,
still not decided.
As you said, it was an election in the Middle East where we don't know who's going to win, and we still don't know who won. No, but I think, you know, the question isn't settled yet whether Iraq is going to stabilize as a country. And there are people certainly in the United States saying, see, we won, there's elections, it's stable, they're coming in, it was the right thing to do. And I just don't think that the answer is in yet. And, you know, if it does work, great, but at what cost? I mean, look how many Iraqis have died in that process, and look how many Americans have died. I mean, it's far fewer, but, you know, they're over there fighting a battle that really wasn't theirs. And, you know, it just, when you unleash a war like that, you just unleash forces that you don't know what the consequences are going to be. And I don't think that there's anything that's happening in Iraq that you can really crow about at this point. Yes, people are involved in the democratic process. Could you have gotten? Can you get that in another way? Probably. You know, it would take it would have been impossible to unseat Saddam. But is the price worth it? And I think that that's something that sort of the Iraqis have to decide from themselves. I don't think outsiders can say, yes, look, you're a democracy, so we did the right thing. And you know, I think it's probably too soon, because you had a multicultural society there that got along in a lot of ways, and you know, Saddam was heinous, and it's not clear that that multicultural society is going to survive from what comes out of this. So I just think, you know, it's great that they're involved in the election system, but I think, again, I'm repeating myself here, but I think it's going to come down to them to decide whether they emerged better from it or not.
What do you think?
I don't know the answer yet. I don't think trading the insecurity of living under the Ba'ath system for, the insecurity that they have now is a good trade. Maybe in the long run, they will get a country, as the one Libyan woman said, why can't we just be normal? They will get a country that's normal in the eyes of the world, but they haven't gotten it yet. It's 7 years in, so how long does that process take? So I'm still not convinced it was a good thing.
Okay, I think we have 2 questions here, one here, and then one the lady back there. Yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask you your views on the Israel-Palestine issue and the importance of it to be solved, and also for Israel actually to stop the settlements in order to give Palestinians also a future, which is basically the fundament to build a civil society. If people don't have future, they turn to extremism. And obviously that's what the West has in mind and when fighting these wars. And I think the most important issue is actually to solve that conflict so people can actually get a future as we enjoy it here, as many people enjoy it around the world, but unfortunately a lot of people in the Middle East are not enjoying it.
I always tell the story that I lived in Jerusalem in 1993. I moved there virtually the same month that the Oslo Accords were announced. It was a moment of optimism, I think, on both sides there that something was really going to change. And I was optimistic, and I'm going to tell a little aside here, but the only kind of American thing that I love every year that when I take overseas with me is Thanksgiving dinner. I just love the menu, and I love the concept that it's not about presents or anything. It's just sort of about getting people around the table. And so it was announced in 1993, and November rolled around, and it was time for Thanksgiving. And so I decided that in the spirit of the year, I would have a Thanksgiving dinner for everybody. And so I invited 2 Israelis and 2 Palestinians and 2 Jordanians and my British neighbor and me. And the day I went to make the dinner, because the press corps was having a collective dinner, I went to put the turkey in the oven, and the door came off in my hands. And it was a Saturday, and so there's it was a day off on both Jewish and Muslim sides of the city, and so I couldn't get any repairman to come put the oven door back on. And I tried propping it with the door, and I tried it with duct tape, and nothing would work. So I called my mother in Vermont, and I said, "Ma, the oven door fell off. What do I do?" And she said, "Oh, that happened to me one year, dear. Just turn the oven up to 700 and put the turkey in anyway." And I said, "Really? Did that work?" And she said, "No, it was burned on the outside and raw in the middle." So I was like, big help. So I called all my sort of reporter friends who had big industrial ovens, and I said, "Can I come use your oven?" And they all said, "No, we're going to our own party." So I said, "Okay, I'm just going to have to call my guests." So I called all my guests, and I said, if you want to eat, if you want this meal to come off, you have to give me your ovens. And so I got ovens on. I got the turkey and the British neighbor next door, and then the vegetables and the dessert and everything I got on both sides. So actually, I had a taxi, and I'd go back and forth between the Arab side and the Israeli side all day long, and I would take things out of the oven, I'd put them back in, and I'd baste. And I burned one potato dish, and I was very proud of that. But it was a moment of optimism, and I got all those people to sit around the table, and they were all very happy to be there and talking about the prospect. Now, all those same people, I've lost touch with some of them, but I'm not sure I could get them to sit down at the same table, much less talk about the peace process, because there's been this horrible decay. And I think if you go back and look at that moment, though, there was a desire on both sides to make it work. I think that the Palestinians thought that they were going to get the Israelis out of their lives on a day-to-day basis. And the interesting thing about the Palestinians also that you see in a way that you don't see in other Arab countries is that, and this was truer before the satellite TVs came in, is that they spend so much time, some of them in Israeli jails, but everybody watching Israeli TV, that they kind of know how democracy works. You get it in a way that they don't. And, they know how a parliament works. They know how a Supreme Court works. In the way that the Western values think it should work, and they kind of like it, and they kind of wanted the same thing. And Arafat way oversold that peace agreement, and they all thought that that's what they were getting. And you know, the Israelis thought they were going to get breathing space and some acceptance in the area, and it didn't happen. And you know, every time those agreements come along, you know, there's extremists on both sides who want to derail them, and it takes very strong political leadership on both sides to be willing to plow through and make it happen. And neither side has had it up to this point. Yeah, I know that. I know. But you also need a leadership that, you know, I mean, the Palestinians, they're never going to win militarily, and they're never going to get world sympathy by getting military, and yet they try and pursue a military objective, and they're never going to get a state that way. You know, if they did build civil society and they did build, you know, if they approached it in a different way, they'd get. I agree with you, but you have to, you know, you have to figure out a way to do it so that both sides are secure, or else it doesn't hold.
But isn't it actually the American leadership that's missing? That's
Yeah.
the real leadership.
Yeah, it is.
Obama won't cut off the money. He hasn't taken that decision. That's the only way, really,
no, I think,
to
I mean,
affect change.
it is political volition. And I think, I mean, when I say bad political leadership, I mean on all sides, including the American. I think that if you talk to the publics, I think the publics basically want the same thing, but there just hasn't been anybody who's been willing to, you know, make the moves and be forceful enough to make the agreement stick.
Okay.
Including the U.S.
Including the U.S. Yeah, yeah.
Especially
Yeah, especially, no, I'm not, I do not disagree at all.
Okay, we're almost running out of time, so I've got Gelare over there, I've got you here, and then I think that's it.
Hi, Neil. My name is Gelare. I want to bring the topic back to the idea of rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
How could the rule of law exist in the Middle East? I'm kind of wondering what kind of changes need to take place for that to happen, and can that exist where there's so much duality in the culture?
So much, sorry?
Can that exist? Can that system exist when there's so much duality in the culture?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think that it's an interesting question because you know, a lot of my experience has been in Egypt on those things, and Egypt actually has a pretty strong judicial system. I mean, it's technically terribly backwards. I mean, you go into these courtrooms and you look for files and nothing's on computers and there's stacks of documents everywhere. But the judges in Egypt sort of really kind of have a certain amount of self-respect and think what they do is important. So I think that if you had, for example, Egyptian judges as election observers in that country, you would probably get a lot fairer election than you would with nobody observing them. So I mean, I can't speak for every single country because I don't know them that well. But again, Mr. Marzouki in Morocco, his point was that the Moroccan Constitution, they didn't like, Article 23 of the Moroccan Constitution is one sentence, and it says that the king's person is sacred and inviolable, and that's it. And so everything the king touches then becomes sacred. So that's a problem for establishing the rule of law. But in a lot of these countries, they do have constitutions that are based on constitutions where the country rule of law works. So I think you have to, I mean, that's one of the things that has to be done is sort of strengthen the legal systems and strengthen the judiciary in order to be able to make it independent. And I think that there are a lot of rights and human rights organizations in all those countries that recognize that and are working towards it. And how do outsiders strengthen it? It's one of those things, like in Morocco, they were trying to give a course to a bunch of Moroccan lawyers to sort of help them with this stuff. But lawyers tend to be a field that attracts a lot of people from the Muslim Brotherhood, which have a certain hostile attitude towards the Americans, sort of more pronounced than the rest of society, and suddenly realized that the American government was the one underwriting their course, and they all left. And so you have to kind of find a way to help them develop the skills they need without identifying it or making it part of a particular government's aid program.
Yes, I just want to say something, that people in the Middle East are not uniform and countries are really rather different. So when we talk about the Middle East, I hope people understand that. And something else about the peace in the Middle East and between Israel and the Palestinians. I was with Yasser Arafat in Tunisia when he was going to Gaza. And I also was with the Norwegians when they signed Oslo. And I tell you that they really believed there was going to be peace. There is no peace in the Middle East simply because Israel doesn't want to make peace. And I do agree with the lady, as long as there is no peace, there are many reasons why, while extremists and fundamentalists would use it. I don't agree with it, but I see why they use it. People need hope, people need lives. And as long as you have an apartheid system existing in Israel, this is not going to happen. There will be more extremism and violence.
I agree. It would solve an enormous amount of problems, and it's the right thing to do. That's why it should be solved. Palestinians should not live under occupation. That's sort of the final sentence. But I also don't think it's going to create this instant utopia in the Middle East. I mean, President Mubarak, if there's peace sign in Egypt, is going to say, "Oh, I've been president for 35 years, and now there's peace in the Middle East. I'll resign."
Mubarak will not be there when there is peace. I can promise you that. He's 80-something years old, so I don't think he'll be there.
I mean, I'm using that as an example. I don't think all those repressive governments are not suddenly going to step aside because there's peace in the Middle East.
No, but it will help a lot in the Middle East, especially when it comes to extremism and
I don't disagree.
Thank you.
And I also, on the monolith thing, usually when I give these talks, I give it as a speech. And the first thing I say is we can't lump them all together. There are important differences in every country, but there are some characteristics or issues that they share.
Just one quick point to wrap it up, and then we're really out of time. I was thinking back to when the book first came out in the US a year ago, and it was in this heady, euphoric days of the early Obama presidency, and there was the rhetoric coming out of the White House was very kind of, extending a hand of friendship, particularly with Iran, and this hopeful messages coming out about the peace process in the Middle East. And 1 year later, things have moved on, and it's not as bright anymore, the outlook. And I'm just wondering, how do you feel about what's happening in the Middle East now? And do the recommendations you made about American foreign policy in the book, are they still something that you think, are those things still valid in your mind?
I mean, I think that President Obama really wanted to make a difference, and I think he looks at the region. I think he has a realistic. I think he has a realistic understanding of what the issues are and what needs to be solved, and where the Americans can help. And I think the Cairo speech, I mean, he hit the right notes. In terms of saying that Americans had to listen more and not try and force their ideas down people's throats, that they had to do more to sort of support ordinary people and not deal with regimes so much. They needed to help outreach in terms of education, because that's one thing. Even if people are opposed to the United States, they still appreciate the fact that that American education can be a good thing. And I just the problem is that just with all the economic issues in the United States, with the war in Iraq, with the war in Afghanistan, et cetera, that the Middle East has slipped way down on the list of things to do. And I think that, the Arab world has been disillusioned enough by American leaders that they just don't believe them. I mean, Bush was forever saying we need a Palestinian state and did absolutely nothing to bring it about. And I think that they're so tired of hearing those promises from American leaders that they just don't believe them anymore. And, with the Obama administration sort of distracted by other domestic issues, they haven't spent a lot of time concentrating on the Middle East. And so I think there's a disappointment with that in the region, and there's a feeling like, it's the same, and the Americans haven't really changed.
Do you not think the problem is that this political battle between the Republicans and Democrats in America, that neither of them will be prepared to take a strong line on Israel and put pressure on them? And until you get that pressure, there's going to be no progress. And is there any possibility of the two Republicans and the Democrats coming together and not making it a political battleground, but having a united policy of putting the pressure on the Israelis and saying, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that, you've got to do this, or we will withdraw our support? Seems to me until that happens, nothing is going to come. Nothing's going to be solved at all. It depends on the Americans coming together and stop making this a political football with all to do with votes there. This seems to be the fundamental matter.
It is. It's a domestic issue. It's it's one of the flaws in the American political system, and it's not just a question of the Arab-Israeli dispute. I mean, you look at the gun laws in the United States, and it's whoever has the strongest lobby gets to set the policy, and it definitely. I mean, the last time I think an American president threatened Israel was probably Eisenhower. But I don't think, again, you can't say that it's monolithic. I mean, there are groups that in the United States that don't like the current policy, that are, are trying to work against it. And it remains to be seen how successful they are. I mean, I think the fact that President Obama has been confrontational with both sides to an extent, and certainly with the Israeli government, seems to indicate that he is willing. We haven't seen sort of the domestic ramifications of that play out yet, but I think that's a change.
Okay, I think we're completely out of time, but we'll be downstairs and you can speak to him downstairs. We're just out of time here.
And
Thank you,
if anybody would like me
Neil.
to sign a book, I'd be happy to do that as well.
I just wanted to say, if you haven't read the book, there are copies of it for sale here, one order of business.
What's your name?
Neil is here
A-M-A-L,
to sign
right?
books. And thank you, Neil. Thank you very much.